Welcome to Channel Frescont. I was about to leave, and I made sure to say goodbye the right way this time. Don't come back, my wife said offhandedly as I stepped out the door. Normally, my farewell to her would have been something like, "Go away," but today felt different. I didn't want our last words to each other to be so harsh. In our 14 years of marriage, we'd thrown those phrases back and forth countless times. But this time, I wasn't planning on coming back in a few days, and maybe, just maybe, she'd realize the weight behind what I said. For the past 6 or 7 months, Emily, my wife, had become more and more cutting with her words. Her remarks felt like tiny daggers, sharp and deliberately hurtful. I had no clue what had changed or why she was acting this way. To keep things from escalating, I started steering clear of her as much as possible. I'd spend hours in my car, coming home late at night after she and our 13-year-old daughter had already eaten. Sometimes, there'd be leftovers waiting for me. Other times, I'd find the scraps had been tossed before I even walked through the door. Oh, by the way, my name's John Miller. Well, technically it's David John Miller. People call me John to avoid mixing me up with my dad, who's also David. I'm not a junior though. My dad's full name is David John Kaminsky, so no, junior, title for me. Why he skipped that, I've got no idea. Honestly, I wouldn't have minded being called Junior or DJ, but instead I got Kurt. Yes, I'm Polish, or, to be more specific, an American with Polish roots. And before you ask, I've already heard every Polish joke out there. Growing up in a small town of around 10,000 people meant I was the punchline more often than not. To be fair, I'm only half Polish. The rest of me is a mix of German, French, Irish, and English. Still, my last name, Kaminsky, makes the Polish part stick out like a sore thumb. As for Emily, who will soon officially be my ex-wife, well, she turned out to be someone I didn't recognize. Just a few weeks ago, I discovered the truth about her, and it hit me like a freight train. The distance I'd been keeping these past few months wasn't just about her cruel words, it was also about her actions. One Monday afternoon, I stopped by a local restaurant for a quick bite. While I was there, I overheard a conversation at the next table. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was Emily, and David, my best friend. They were talking about their affair, laughing and reminiscing about all the time they'd spent together while I was clueless and busy. I left quietly, slipping out unnoticed, my mind racing. David. Of all people, David. He'd been my best man at our wedding, for crying out loud. He even drove us that day. On top of that, he's my go-to mechanic, the guy I trust to work on my cars. Well, technically, he's an independent contractor, but I've relied on him for years to keep my vehicles in top shape. Oh, and did I mention? I'm a used car salesman. I've heard all the stereotypes and insults about that line of work, too. But here's the kicker, my business is doing just fine, thank you very much. People know that when they buy a car from me, they're getting a solid deal. They trust me because I stand by what I sell. If a car has issues, I make it right. David has always been a reliable mechanic, and I kept him busy with steady work and good pay. At one point, I even offered him a full-time position, but he turned it down. He joked that he'd lose respect for himself if he worked for someone else. I knew there was more truth than humor in his words. Still, I hired him as my go-to contractor. Though, let's be honest, he wasn't all that independent. My business was practically his sole source of income, a fact that would eventually be his undoing. After leaving the restaurant, I drove aimlessly through the neighborhood, my mind racing. Could it be true? I asked myself. Was David really seeing Emily? Or was it some kind of sick joke? I considered hiring a private investigator, but if David had been honest about only meeting Emily twice a month, it might just be throwing money away. Instead, I decided to investigate on my own. When I got home, Emily was as irritable as usual. That suited me just fine. I wasn't in the mood for conversation. I wanted to find answers before facing her. After she drifted off to sleep on her side of the bed, I quietly got up and checked her email. Nothing suspicious there. Her phone, however, was locked with a passcode. It didn't take long to figure out the code. It was our daughter's birth date. Scrolling through her messages, I found a few that could be taken the wrong way, but nothing concrete. There were no texts from David, though his name was in her contacts. That wasn't strange since he was my closest friend. Maybe it really was just a joke, I thought. Still, Emily's recent behavior kept gnawing at me. Even if it wasn't David, there was a chance something else was going on. I climbed back into bed, my thoughts swirling. Sleep didn't come easily, and the last time I looked at the clock, it read 2:43 a.m. The next day at the dealership, David stopped by, as he often did. He made another one of his usual jokes about Poles. Normally, I'd chuckle and brush it off, but not today. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "David, what do you even know about Poland? I bet if I handed you a world map, you couldn't even point it out. You joke about Poles being fools, but I'm pretty sure they could find the US, maybe even our state, on a map. How about you educate yourself for a change?" David stared at me, completely caught off guard. He knew I was right. There was no way he'd find Poland on a map, even if his life depended on it. David had never been much for academics. He was street smart, and a damn good mechanic, but books and maps? Not his thing. I guess that's why we became friends back in high school. I'd helped him scrape by just enough to graduate. Now, I was rethinking those friendships, including my relationship with Emily. Closing the door to my office, I sank into my chair, lost in thought. How could I prove what might be happening? Confronting them outright wouldn't get me anywhere. It would just lead to denials. I needed solid evidence. I reached out to a private investigator in Santa Fe and laid out my suspicions. He listened carefully but explained that surveillance wouldn't be cost-effective given how rarely they seemed to meet. Instead, he suggested a more practical approach, installing a tracker on my wife's phone to monitor her movements discreetly. He also mentioned the possibility of setting up cameras in the house but cautioned that cheaper models could be easily detected. I decided to go with the tracking app he recommended. After everyone had gone to bed, I carefully installed it on Emily's phone, making sure it was synced and running in the background undetected. The next day, I checked the app throughout the day to track her whereabouts. Emily worked part-time at the university bookstore, usually clocking in 15 to 20 hours a week. Her modest paycheck often went toward trips to the beauty salon. Later that day, she stopped by the grocery store before heading home. Meanwhile, David appeared to be at his house for most of the day, except, coincidentally, when Emily was nearby. That gave me some reassurance that nothing inappropriate had happened, at least not that day. Wanting to bridge the growing gap between us, I suggested we have dinner as a family. Emily hesitated, and my daughter, Sophia, gave me the typical teenage eye roll of reluctance. But I didn't back down, and eventually, they both agreed to join me. Dinner was nice, though nothing groundbreaking. At one point, I casually mentioned David in the conversation. Emily's reaction was immediate. Her discomfort was written all over her face as she quickly changed the subject. That only heightened my suspicions. I desperately wanted to figure out the truth behind David's comments and Emily's behavior. That night, I decided against checking her phone again. My previous attempts had been fruitless. Either she was deleting her messages too quickly, or she wasn't sending anything incriminating at all. As we got ready for bed, I thanked Emily for agreeing to have dinner together. To my surprise, she responded with a rare hint of gratitude. Mixed emotions churned in me. If she had been unfaithful, how was I supposed to handle it? I wasn't sure if I could confront her until I had undeniable proof. Later that night, we were intimate, but it felt routine. There's no better way to describe it. Nothing passionate, nothing worth diving into. Still, there was a tiny bit of comfort in the familiarity of it. For the rest of the week, I continued monitoring her phone. Every time I checked, there was nothing suspicious to find. On Saturday night, after Emily had fallen asleep, I found myself checking her phone again. As before, there was nothing, no suspicious messages or calls. I started convincing myself that David had just been talking big, spinning tales of his supposed conquests to boost his ego. It wouldn't have been the first time. I'd known about his tendency to exaggerate since we were kids. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Back in bed, I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. By 2 a.m., I gave up and headed downstairs for a drink, hoping it would settle my restless thoughts. I poured myself a glass of Jack Daniels and Coke and sat at the kitchen table. Emily's phone was still in my hand, so I decided to check it one more time. I unlocked it using the same password, our daughter's birth date. As I navigated to the home screen, a sudden realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The password, our daughter's birth date, was more significant than I'd ever considered. Sophia's pregnancy hadn't been easy. There had been complications because her Rh factor didn't match Emily's. At times, it felt like Emily's body was rejecting the baby. During the last 3 weeks, she was confined to bed rest to ensure Sophia made it to term. When Sophia was born, exactly 9 months after our wedding, we were overjoyed that she was healthy. But those early months were tough. Sophia was a fussy baby, she cried all the time, couldn't sleep, and refused to breastfeed. The stress wore us down. By the time Sophia turned 2, Emily put her foot down and said there would be no more children. I was disappointed, but I understood. The challenges of parenthood had taken a toll on both of us. As I sipped my drink, another thought crept in, one that made my stomach churn. Sophia had been conceived during our honeymoon, or so I had always believed. She was what people called a honeymoon baby. But what if she wasn't? What if David's claims had some truth to them? Emily had been on birth control before we got married, and we hadn't waited until the wedding night to be intimate. In fact, our physical connection had always been a big part of our relationship. I remembered how, when Emily's pregnancy was confirmed, the doctor had mentioned that stress could impact the effectiveness of birth control. If the pills failed on our wedding night, could they have failed before that too? The pieces started to click together, and I felt my heart sink. If David had been with Emily before we got married, there was a real possibility that Sophia wasn't my biological daughter. I knew what I had to do. I got up from the table and went to the bathroom to grab a few cotton swabs and a Ziploc bag. Then I quietly made my way to Sophia's room. She was sound asleep, snoring softly with her mouth slightly open. It was almost too easy. Gently, I swabbed the inside of her cheek and sealed the sample in the bag. Afterward, I did the same for myself. If the test proved Sophia was mine, I'd still have questions about Emily's loyalty. But if she wasn't, well, I'd deal with that when the time came. Sunday was a day for chores, each of us focused on our own tasks. I deliberately kept to myself, avoiding lengthy interactions with Emily or Sophia to mask the turmoil I was feeling inside. Even though I was desperate for answers, doubt gnawed at me all day. At one point, Emily asked why I seemed so distant. Thinking on my feet, I told her I was preoccupied with plans for our business. Emily always called it our business, which was oddly comforting, even though I had set up a separate legal entity for the dealership to protect my personal assets. Living in a conservative town, I made it a point to keep business matters from spilling over into my personal life. That same caution extended to my finances. I handled credit card payments myself and minimized risks, all in an effort to shield myself from any fallout, particularly if Emily ever caught wind of what I was doing. By Monday morning, I was done waiting. I grabbed the DNA samples and headed to Western New Mexico University. I approached the head of the science department, explaining my situation as vaguely as possible while requesting genetic testing. To my relief, they agreed to run the tests as part of their molecular biology program. Wanting to show my appreciation, I handed the department head a few business cards and mentioned that anyone involved in processing the samples would get a 10% discount on a car purchase. He chuckled and said he'd been thinking about replacing his old Camry. "Feel free to stop by the lot," I told him. "If you don't see anything you like, let me know, and I'll track down something that fits your needs." "Thanks, I'll keep that in mind," he replied with a friendly smile. I returned to my car, my stomach churning despite the small victory. The reality of what the test results could mean weighed heavily on me. The thought of my marriage ending felt like a punch to the gut. Later, when Emily asked why I seemed distracted, I told her I was thinking about restocking the lot with new inventory. It wasn't a total lie. Truthfully, it wasn't a bad idea. I called Paul, my loan officer and occasional salesman, into my office to float the idea. "Let's make it happen," I said, outlining my plan. "We can do that," James replied confidently. "One more thing," I added. "I want to pay off the mortgage on my house. Can we work out a lump sum payment?" James nodded. "Let me check the numbers. I'll circle back after lunch." As he left, I considered calling my attorney to ask for a referral to a family lawyer, but quickly stopped myself. Don't get ahead of yourself, I thought. Wait for the results. You haven't found any solid evidence yet. After lunch, James returned with a spreadsheet, and we went over the logistics of both plans. Still, the next 2 days felt like an eternity. I was a man on edge, waiting for news that could change everything. Late Wednesday night, my phone rang. It was the department head. He said he'd stop by with the results, and also wanted to check out some cars while he was there. When he arrived, I greeted him and led him straight to my office. The look on his face told me everything before he even spoke. Then he confirmed it. The two samples I had submitted were not related. I nodded, trying to keep my composure, but he could see that, even though I had half expected this, the news hit me like a freight train. He gave me a moment to process it, then handed me a manila envelope containing the official results. I opened it and scanned the paper. The confirmation was there in black and white, stark and undeniable. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus on something else. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "what kind of car were you thinking about?" He smiled, sensing my attempt to redirect the conversation. "Well, I know this sounds cliché, but I just turned 50 and I'm thinking about a sports car. Maybe a Mazda Miata?" I nodded, grateful for the distraction. "I don't have one on the lot right now, but I'm heading to an auction tomorrow. I'll see if I can find one in excellent condition for you. I'll call you later in the day to let you know what I come across." "Sounds great," he said. After he left, I turned to Olivia, my assistant. "I'm heading out early today. If you need anything, you know where to reach me." Olivia rarely needed to call me. She was more than capable of handling things on her own. I left the dealership and drove aimlessly around town, observing the familiar streets and storefronts that now felt strangely foreign. Everything looked different, as though I was seeing it all through a filter of betrayal and anger. Finally, I pulled over and called my attorney. I told him everything. He sounded genuinely sympathetic, but he wasn't a family lawyer, so he referred me to a colleague he trusted to handle the situation. I scheduled an appointment for later that evening. The next day, I stopped at a quiet restaurant for a bite to eat. As I sat there, pushing food around on my plate, I reflected on the last 15 years of my life. They felt wasted. I couldn't even claim to have a child from this marriage. Yes, I still considered Sophia my daughter in some ways. How could I not? I'd been there since the moment she was born. But biologically, she wasn't mine. What should I do next? The thought churned in my mind, relentless. I couldn't unlearn the truth. Ignorance was no longer an option. One thing was clear: David would pay. I didn't care that he had been my best friend for years. With friends like him, who needed enemies? And Emily, she would pay too. Did she know Sophia wasn't mine? Maybe she didn't, but it didn't matter. She had hidden the truth of her affair, kept this monumental betrayal from me, and had the audacity to carry on meeting him in secret at least twice a month. Anger bubbled up inside me. I gripped the edge of the table, fighting to stay in control. I knew I couldn't go home that night. I needed space, isolation, somewhere to sort through my emotions without risking an explosion. I called Emily. "Hi, Kurt," she answered. "Hey," I replied flatly. "I'm staying in Albuquerque tonight. The auction starts early in the morning, and I want to be prepared." "Oh. Okay," she stammered. "Safe travels." Her hesitation wasn't lost on me. I rarely went to Albuquerque for auctions, and she knew it. I wondered if she'd take advantage of my absence to meet with David. She'd have to explain Sophia's whereabouts to my parents, which wouldn't be easy, but I doubted she'd let that stop her. As I drove toward Albuquerque, I glanced at the phone tracker periodically, planning to monitor her movements through the night. I tried to refocus on the auction. My goal was to purchase at least 20 cars, including a Mazda Miata for the department head. Arrangements would need to be made for the vehicles to be inspected and delivered to my lot. The real question was, who could I trust to handle the inspections? It was obvious David was no longer an option. Once he wrapped up his current tasks, I'd cut him off completely. When David found out I had purchased 24 cars, I knew he'd see dollar signs, already calculating how much he could charge me for inspections and repairs. But he wasn't going to get that chance. I planned to keep my purchases under wraps until the very last minute. Instead, I intended to speak with one of the auction dealers in Albuquerque to find someone reliable and trustworthy to handle the inspections before shipping the cars to our small town. I arrived in Albuquerque around 9 a.m. and checked into a Best Western. Even though I owned my own business, I couldn't justify spending company funds on an expensive hotel. A comfortable bed and a clean room were all I needed. I've always been a simple man with simple needs. As soon as I settled into the room, I pulled out my phone and checked Emily's tracker. Her location showed she was still at home, or at least, her phone was. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind churned with thoughts about why she had done it. How could she justify spending the night with him on our wedding day, let alone carrying on with him for years? I found myself reconsidering everything about our marriage. It was never perfect, sure. But I had thought we loved each other exclusively. Now, I knew that belief had been a mistake from the start. After our wedding, things hadn't gone according to plan. We never intended to have a baby right away. The plan was to wait 3 or 4 years before starting a family and eventually have 3 kids. But Sophia's complicated pregnancy derailed those plans. And now, knowing that David had been involved from the beginning made all of our struggles feel pointless. 14 years of effort wasted. There had been good moments, of course, but even those felt tainted now. If Emily hadn't been with David, maybe she would have conceived a child with me. Perhaps the pregnancy would have been smoother, and our child less difficult. But instead, David had ruined everything. He seduced my future wife on our wedding day, mocked me behind my back, and continued to see her at least twice a month for years. And I had paid him, literally, for all this time. As I lay in bed trying to process everything, anger consumed me again. I clenched my fists, staring at the ceiling. I had to calm myself down somehow, or I'd never get any rest. Reaching for the remote, I turned on the TV and flipped through the channels until I found a comedy show. The mindless laughter worked like a balm on my nerves, and by 11 p.m., I felt steady enough to sleep. Tomorrow would be a long day, and I needed all the energy I could muster. The auction was a success. I picked up several great cars at excellent prices and made connections with a few dealers from the Albuquerque area. There were no Miatas at the auction itself, but when I asked around, 2 dealers mentioned they each had one red, one black. They assured me they'd be willing to strike a deal once I knew which color my client preferred. "Just let us know which ones are coming to your lot, and we'll work it out," one of them said. The experience made me realize I should attend these auctions more often. Meeting other businessmen in the same industry sparked ideas for expanding my business. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of inspiration, a reminder that not everything in my life had to feel like it was falling apart. The auction had served as a temporary distraction from my personal turmoil, but reality came crashing back during my afternoon meeting with the lawyer. The news was as bad as I had feared. In the event of a divorce, I would lose half of everything I owned. Worse, I'd be obligated to pay alimony and child support, for a child that wasn't even mine. Divorce didn't seem like the solution anymore. Instead, I resolved to leave Emily with David's child and the life she had built around our marriage. My first step was to pay off the mortgage on the house, ensuring she could stay in it. However, with the mortgage in my name, she wouldn't have the power to sell the property without my involvement. I'd continue covering the taxes and utilities, but it would remain my house, even if I moved out. I also needed to figure out how to safeguard my business. Though it was registered as a corporation, I knew Emily could still find a way to claim part of it. I needed advice from my business attorney on how best to protect it. When I walked through the door that evening, I felt the exhaustion of the day settle over me like a heavy blanket. "I'm tired. I'm going to take a shower and go straight to bed," I told Emily, heading toward the bedroom. "Do you want dinner?" she called after me. "I had a late lunch," I replied, somewhat grateful she'd asked. The hot shower was a rare moment of solace, washing away the weight of my troubles, if only temporarily. While my problems remained, the steps I had started taking to address them gave me a small sense of control. That night, I fell asleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. For the first time in weeks, I woke up feeling somewhat refreshed. I left for the office before Emily and Sophia were even awake, eager to get a head start on the day. Once there, I buried myself in spreadsheets, financial reports, and sales forecasts. When James arrived, I filled him in on the 23 cars I had purchased and shared my plans to finalize the deal for the Miata at the Albuquerque dealership. I also instructed Olivia to stop assigning any new work to David but asked her to handle it discreetly. Olivia gave me a curious look but nodded. "You're the boss," she said. "Thanks, Olivia. You're indispensable," I replied, genuinely appreciative of her efficiency. At 9 a.m., I called my business attorney. I explained the situation and asked what measures I could take to protect the business. "Well," he began, "your business is registered as a corporation, but it's still possible for her to argue for a share of its value in court. One way to avoid that would be to sell the business in advance, but that's a drastic step. No, selling isn't an option, I said firmly. This business is my life. I've poured everything into it. I can't just give it up. Understood, he replied. Let me review the specifics of your case and the applicable laws. I'll get back to you by the end of the week with some recommendations. I hung up, frustrated but determined. Losing my business wasn't an option. I had built it from the ground up, sacrificing years of hard work and personal time. Now I couldn't allow Emily, or the mistakes she had made, to jeopardize everything I had achieved. It felt as though everything I had worked so hard to build, my business, my life, was slipping through my fingers. The weight of it all bore down on me, and my thoughts inevitably turned to Sophia. She was my child, no matter what the DNA test said. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. But the rage came creeping back, unbidden and unstoppable, when I thought about how David had shattered that illusion. Part of being a good businessman, though, is the ability to compartmentalize. I had to push my personal problems aside and focus on what needed to be done. First on my list was calling Tom, the department head who had delivered the DNA test results. Hi Tom, this is John Miller. I've got information on 2 Miatas you might be interested in, one red and one black. Still in the market? I asked. Absolutely, he said. Depends on the price, though. Which color are you leaning toward? I can bring it by for you to take a look, and we can talk numbers. Even if we don't come to an agreement, I'm confident I can sell it elsewhere, I replied. Which would you recommend? He asked. Well, the red is bold and eye-catching, but it tends to fade faster if left in the sun. The black is sleek but harder to keep clean in our climate. Do you have a garage for it? Yes, I do. In that case, I'd recommend the red. If it's stored indoors, fading won't be an issue. Plus, it's a real head-turner. But if you feel the black suits your style more, it's still a solid choice. Red sounds great. How soon can I see it? Would Monday or Tuesday work for you? Absolutely. Just call me when you've got it, he said. After we hung up, I called the dealer with the red Miata to arrange a trade. He was interested in a BMW I had sitting on my lot. It had been gathering dust for months, definitely a car better suited to a big city market. The trade seemed like a win-win. Not long after, David showed up. He still had a few cars he was working on, and as an independent contractor, he could come and go as he pleased as long as he met his deadlines. That arrangement had always worked fine, until now. I noticed him lingering near a group of salespeople who were chatting about the 23 cars I had purchased. His curiosity got the better of him, and he made his way over to me. Hey Kurt, where are all these cars coming from? He asked. The auction, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Got it. I'll make sure to carve out time to handle the repairs, he said casually. They'll arrive late next week or early the following week. The auction house will take care of delivery, I added, doing my best to maintain a calm demeanor despite the burning anger inside. All right. I'll check in with Olivia and get on the schedule, he said before walking away. As he left, I couldn't help but chuckle. He had no idea that his days of working with me were numbered. That weekend I avoided Emily as much as possible. I kept myself busy, working in the yard and running errands around town. I didn't even bother checking her phone tracker. At this point, it didn't matter. I felt nothing for her but disdain. Finding out I had unknowingly been raising another man's child was a blow I couldn't forgive. By Monday, I was back at the showroom, trying to keep busy. I called up the dealer in Albuquerque and told him I'd bring the BMW over and swap it for the Miata. Sounds great, he said. Let's grab a late lunch when you get here. It was a perfect day for a drive, so I let Anna know I'd be out all day. Hold down the fort, I told her. Will do, boss, she replied. Anna was one of a kind. I really needed to give her a raise. The drive to Albuquerque was peaceful, and lunch with the dealer was even better. He made me feel welcome, like I was catching up with an old friend. On the way back, I drove the Miata, and man, did I enjoy it. The top was down, the wind was running through my hair, and for a moment, I felt free. Somewhere along that drive, I decided I'd call another dealer and order a black one for myself. I didn't need more than a 2-seater now anyway. It was time to start living for myself again. When I pulled into the driveway with the shiny red Miata, Emily caught sight of it from the window. She must have called Sophia because, before I knew it, they were both outside. "Honey, why on earth do you need a car like this?" Emily asked, her tone full of judgment. "We need something with back seats for Sophia." I kept my tone light. "I picked it up in Albuquerque for a client. Thought you might like to take it for a spin." She shook her head, her voice dripping with disdain. "No, honey, I don't like small cars." Turning to Sophia, I motioned toward the car. "How about you, kiddo? Want to take a ride?" Sophia crossed her arms, her response cutting deep. "No, Dad. I get teased enough about my last name as it is. I don't need people seeing me riding around with a used car salesman, especially a Polish one." I stood there stunned. Where was this coming from? And when I glanced at Emily, I realized she didn't seem bothered by Sophia's words at all. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Both women in my life had lost respect for me. Teenagers aren't supposed to be their parents' best friends, sure, but the venom in Sophia's words made me question everything about my family. My life felt like a joke. "Well," I said, forcing myself to stay calm, "I'm going for another drive." I got back in the car and pulled out of the driveway. The roads around Silver City were a blur as I drove, the wind and speed giving me the escape I desperately needed. My marriage was unraveling faster than I could process. When I finally got home around 9:30 p.m., I headed straight for the shower. As I was finishing up, Emily came into the room. The light from the hallway hit me square in the eyes, and I squinted, then closed them. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Are you upset because we didn't fall in love with your little sports car? Are you seriously not coming downstairs to spend time with your family? You're not just Polish, you're acting like a child." I stared at her, trying to make sense of this sudden hostility. Her words didn't feel like hers, they felt like David's. He'd been around her enough, and his dismissive attitude toward my heritage had clearly rubbed off. Now she was passing that same contempt onto her daughter. Her daughter, not mine. That was something I needed to accept. I was responsible for her, sure, but she wasn't my child. "It seems like you and your daughter don't want a Polish man around," I said, my anger boiling over. "Maybe I should just go." Emily didn't reply, and her silence spoke volumes. The house felt icy and unwelcoming after that. The next day, Tom came by to check out the Miata. He loved it, practically beamed as he looked it over. At least someone was thrilled about something in my life. Tom and I got down to business, discussing the numbers. He couldn't believe the deal, $3,000 under Kelly Blue Book. "This is an amazing price," he said. "My best friend handles car purchases for a college program," I told him. "We exchange about 16 cars every 2 years. It's not a ton, but you should definitely reach out to him. I'm always happy to make a deal. I'll have Jim give you a call later this week," Tom replied. "Thanks," I said. Moments like these were how I built my business, treating people right and showing them I appreciated their referrals. By Wednesday, my lawyer called with news. "Hey, Kurt, I think I've come up with a solution to your potential problem. Can you swing by this afternoon to go over it?" "Of course," I said. "I can't wait to get started. The atmosphere at home is unbearable." Later that day, I sat down with him to hear the plan. It sounded solid, and though it would take about 2 weeks to execute, I was optimistic it'd be worth it. During those 2 weeks, I began quietly moving my personal items and tools out of the house into an apartment nearby. At the same time, David was eagerly waiting for the 24 cars he thought he'd be working on. When he'd ask about them, I'd just dodge the question. Over the weekend, I kept busy in the yard, making sure to clean out my closet and drawers when Emily and Sophia weren't around. Since Emily usually handled the laundry during the week, she didn't notice how empty my closet had become. That brings me to Monday night, when I finally told Emily, "I'm leaving." Her response? The same as always, mocking me as a Polish man and a used car salesman. In the past, I let her get to me and would leave for a night or two, crashing at a motel depending on how angry I was. But this time was different. On Tuesday morning, I got to the lot early. As the employees trickled in, I asked everyone to meet me in the conference room. It wasn't unusual, we had regular weekly meetings, but this one was different. Once everyone had settled, I closed the door and started. Good morning, everyone. As you all know, the cars I bought a couple of weeks ago arrived yesterday afternoon. They've been inspected and prepped, so they're ready for sale. Starting today, we'll no longer be using David for any work here. If he asks, just tell him we've decided to go in another direction and leave it at that. The room was quiet, everyone taking in what I just said. I paused, swallowing hard before continuing. Now, this next part is tough for me. You're like family to me, all of you. Nothing is going to change regarding your jobs, except for one thing. I glanced at Anna, and my voice softened. Anna will be stepping up to take on some of my responsibilities, and of course, she'll be receiving a well-deserved raise. The shock in the room gave way to smiles and congratulations as everyone turned to Anna. She looked stunned but grateful. They all respected her and knew she deserved it. Olivia, can you stay behind after the meeting? We'll go over a few details, I said as everyone got up to leave. I'll still be involved with the company, but only as a consultant. I might help out with sales here and there, but I'll make sure not to step on your toes. Hearing that I'd still be around, even occasionally, seemed to ease everyone's nerves. As we filed out of the conference room, David was waiting right outside. Hey, why wasn't I included in the meeting? He asked, his tone edging on indignant. I didn't hesitate. You're not an employee, David. This was a staff meeting, I replied firmly. He faltered, clearly caught off guard, before stammering. I see. Well, now that the cars are here, I'll go ahead and get started on them. No, I said, my voice sharper than usual. The cars have already been inspected and prepped. There's nothing else that needs to be done. David blinked in disbelief. But I've always handled your cars, he said, his voice rising in protest. I've sold the business, I told him, doing my best to keep my tone steady. The new owner has decided to go in a different direction. The stunned look on his face told me he hadn't seen this coming. He opened his mouth to argue but then closed it again. Finally, he burst out. I can't believe you sold the business. What am I supposed to do now? There it was, the predictable self-pity. David had always been good at making everything about himself. You can stop by and pick up your check for the work you've done over the past 2 weeks, I said coolly. It's not much. Olivia hadn't assigned him much work, knowing he was banking on the arrival of the 23 cars to keep him busy. He had assumed he'd be in for a windfall. How wrong he was. I didn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy for him. Honestly, I just wished I could tell him outright how narrow-minded and arrogant he'd been. Later, when I sat down with Olivia, I made sure we were alone. Olivia, I said, lowering my voice, I need you to keep this conversation completely confidential. She nodded without hesitation. Of course, Kurt. You can count on me. Good, I said, leaning in. Here's the deal. I've set up a couple of companies registered in Nevada. One owns this lot, and the other owns that company. I'm the sole shareholder of both. She listened closely, her expression unreadable. At some point, I'm going to divorce Emily, and I want to make sure she doesn't get her hands on the business. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. Why? She asked cautiously. I took a deep breath. I've moved out of the house. Emily doesn't know yet, but I'm not going back. She had an affair with David. And to be honest, I'm pretty sure Sophia isn't even my daughter, she's his. I don't know if Emily's aware of this, and David doesn't know either. But he'll figure it out soon enough. Olivia sat quietly, letting me continue. I'm not filing for divorce just yet. I'll keep paying the utilities and taxes on the house so she can't claim I abandoned her. When the time is right, I'll let her file, probably citing irreconcilable differences. By then, the business will be structured in a way that keeps it out of her reach. I could feel the weight of the situation as I spoke. That's why I set things up this way. It looks like the business has been sold twice. Let them try to unravel that mess. I smiled grimly. By the time the divorce is finalized, any proceeds from the sale will be long gone. And as far as income goes, I'll barely be making anything, just a bit from consulting or the occasional commission. Olivia nodded, taking it all in. You'll be running the daily operations, I added. If you ever have questions, I'm here. But let me say this, I trust you completely. You've got great judgment, and I know you'll do what's best for the business. She looked at me with quiet determination. Thank you, Kurt. I won't let you down. A faint smile crept across Olivia's face when I explained the changes under the new ownership. But when I mentioned Emily and David, her expression hardened, and she looked ready to tear into someone. Olivia was someone I truly admired, strong, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. I knew I could trust her with what came next. "There's one last thing I need you to handle," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Then I'll leave you to it." "Of course, Kurt." "What is it?" "I need you to order a new sign and some updated letterhead. We're changing the name of the business. That should drive the point home for David and Emily that the business has been sold to someone else." She nodded, ready to take notes. "What's the new name?" "Hopeless Car Lot," I said, watching her reaction carefully. Her eyebrows shot up in astonishment. "Hopeless? Are you sure?" I grinned at her surprise. "Someday, I'll explain why I chose that name. Let's just say it tells the whole story." Though she looked puzzled, she gave me a small, understanding smile. Olivia trusted me enough to follow my lead, even when my decision seemed unconventional. With that, I said my goodbyes, thanking everyone again for their hard work and loyalty. As I walked out to my Audi, a strange mix of emotions washed over me: relief, determination, and a touch of sorrow for what I was leaving behind. I hit the road toward Albuquerque, the miles slipping by as I thought about what lay ahead. 2 hours into the drive, my phone rang, the car's hands-free system lighting up with Emily's name on the screen. I sighed. She didn't usually call this soon. In the past, she'd wait a day or two before reaching out, giving me just enough time to stew in anger before the familiar cycle of apologies and temporary change began. Curious about what she had to say this time, I decided to answer. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice even. "Kurt, what's going on?" Her voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Nothing," I replied flatly. "Just heading to Albuquerque." "Why are you going there?" "To pick up a car," I said, as casually as if we were discussing the weather. There was a pause before she spoke again, almost to herself. "Then it's not true. David must have been lying." So, David had already run to her. Of course, he had. Figuratively speaking, she'd reached out to her lover to get the scoop on her husband. The thought made my stomach twist, but I kept my voice neutral. "I don't know," I said, feigning ignorance. "What did he say?" "David called and said you sold the business," she said cautiously. I frowned. "Why would he call you?" There was a quick, awkward silence before she answered. Your best friend just wanted to know what was going on." "Best friend?" I repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity. "That's a good one." David had never been a friend, let alone a best one. He'd been a leech, using me for convenience while sneering behind my back with my own wife. "Well," I said, my voice calm but cold, "apparently my family has been embarrassed by me for being a used car salesman. So yes, I sold the business. Now you won't have to live with that shame anymore." Her voice shifted, worried now. "Shouldn't we have talked about this first? This was my business before we got married," I said firmly. "I can sell it whenever I want. I just hope the new owner treats my former employees as well as I did." "Did you at least get a good price for it?" she asked, clearly more concerned about her standard of living than anything else. "That doesn't matter now," I replied, sidestepping the question. "What matters is that I needed a change. I guess I'll have to start looking for a new job," she said nervously. "After I take a few weeks to relax, of course." "But what about the mortgage?" "Oh, don't worry about that," I said casually. "I used the money from the sale to pay off the house. It's yours free and clear. You'll just need to handle the utilities, taxes, food, gas, and insurance." Her sharp intake of breath was audible. "What? That's too much. You need to work more hours to cover all that," she said, her voice nearing hysteria. "I don't think so," I said firmly. "What do you mean you're not coming back?" she cried. "You can't do this, Kurt. I told you that night when I left. You said not to come back," I reminded her calmly. "So I won't. Don't do this, Kurt. Please," she pleaded. "I already have," I said, my voice unyielding. "But don't worry, I'll make sure the utilities stay on for now. You won't be left in the dark." There was a long silence before she tried another angle. "What about your daughter?" she asked, her tone dripping with guilt-tripping. "You mean Sophia?" I asked, my voice turning icy. The girl who's ashamed of her last name and embarrassed her father was, or is, a used car salesman. Kurt, she's only 13. You can't take it so personally, Emily said, as though dismissing years of disdain. It doesn't matter anymore, I said, shaking my head. I'm not coming back. With that, I ended the call, feeling a sense of finality I hadn't felt before. This time, there would be no apologies, no compromises, and no turning back. Now neither of you will have to feel ashamed of me, I said flatly before hanging up. Without hesitation, I powered off my phone, knowing Emily would be furious when I didn't answer her inevitable barrage of calls. But that was the point. I wanted her to sit with it, to let it sink in. The drive to Albuquerque stretched out quietly, giving me space to decompress from the call. I knew she'd turn to David next, desperate for answers or reassurance, likely sharing everything I'd said. That thought should have made me angry, but instead, it left me feeling oddly detached. I had bigger things to focus on now. When I arrived in Albuquerque, I turned my phone back on, only to find 5 voicemails waiting for me. Predictably, 3 were from Emily, 1 from David, and 1 from Olivia. I skipped the first 4 without a second thought, and called Olivia back immediately. Hi, Olivia. Sorry, I had my phone off. Been dealing with some unwanted calls, I said, grateful to hear a familiar voice. I figured, she said warmly. Your wife and David both called me earlier, asking where you were. I told them you're no longer the owner here, so you don't come in anymore. I hope I handled that okay. That's perfect, I replied, relieved. If they give you too much trouble, just tell them you'll call the police for harassment. Olivia chuckled. I like that idea. Thanks, Kurt. Her tone softened. Look, I know it probably feels like you don't have much of a family or support right now. But believe me, you do. We're your family, and we always will be. Her words hit me in a way I didn't expect. Thank you, Olivia. You always know what to say, I said, meaning every word. I hope your husband knows how lucky he is. He tells me all the time, she said with a smile in her voice. We're never going to lose that. Don't, I said quickly, cutting her off, though my tone wasn't harsh. It just hurt too much to think about what I'd lost, or never really had. After we hung up, I sat for a moment, debating whether to call Emily back. Ultimately, I decided to let her stew. There was nothing more to say, and I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of engaging. I climbed out of the Audi and headed into the dealership office. The owner was waiting for me, just as we'd arranged. I've got that Audi I told you about, I said, tossing him the keys. Want to talk trade? Let's take a look, he said, heading outside with me. He walked around the car, inspected the interior, and even popped the hood. This thing's in great shape. I could sell it in a week. Are you sure you want to trade it? Feels like I'm getting the better end of the deal here. That's fine by me, I said with a shrug. Maybe you can return the favor someday. I'm not here to make money. I'm here to get a sports car. Half an hour later, I was back on the road, the wind in my hair and the sun on my face. The new convertible felt like freedom itself. I didn't have a destination in mind, but heading north seemed as good an idea as any. Santa Fe was beautiful this time of year, and I figured I'd go from there. Over the next 2 weeks, I wandered through northern New Mexico, Arizona, southern Utah, and Colorado, taking in the rugged landscapes and letting the open road clear my mind. I stayed within reach, just in case Olivia needed me back at the business. I checked in with her several times, but every call reassured me she had everything under control. Meanwhile, Emily's calls kept coming. At first, her messages were angry and frantic, demanding answers. Then came the apologies, dripping with regret. Finally, her tone turned bitter, full of accusations and guilt trips. I listened to them all, more out of morbid curiosity than anything else. But I didn't care. I had moved on. The last laugh came when she called to let me know the credit card had been cancelled. Her voice dripped with satisfaction, as if she thought this would hurt me. But as I hung up, I just laughed. What she didn't realize was that I didn't need her money, or her drama, anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. When David called and accused me of being a terrible person for leaving Emily and Sophia, I couldn't help but laugh. The irony of him, of all people, calling me out for my actions was just too much. If he thought his guilt-tripping would make me reconsider, he was delusional. Not long after, my lawyer sent me a message about Emily's latest stunt, a threat to file a restraining order if I didn't contact her or return home. I called him back immediately. "Hey, Kurt," he said as he picked up. "Your wife called earlier and made some threats. She's talking about a restraining order." "Yeah, I figured she'd try something like that," I replied unfazed. "But she doesn't have a leg to stand on. As long as I'm still paying for the house, it'll be tough for her to prove abandonment." "I agree," he said. "Actually, I can do you one better," I added, a smirk forming. "I've got a recording of the night I left. It's me telling her I'm leaving, and her telling me not to come back. Pretty hard to twist that in court." "That's incredible," he said, clearly impressed. "Send me a copy. If she keeps causing problems, I'll bring it to her lawyer. Let them try to spin that." "Will do," I said. "Thanks, as always. Let me know if anything new comes up." "Of course," he said. "I'll check in next week with an update." With that settled, I continued my journey across the Southwest in the Miata. It wasn't the most practical or comfortable car for long drives, but it was undeniably fun. People noticed me wherever I went, and every now and then, I caught the curious gaze of middle-aged women who were probably bored with their routine lives. But I wasn't interested in that. I was still technically married, and no matter how broken things were, I wasn't ready to cross that line. The open road became my sanctuary. I meandered along the California coast, zigzagging from La Jolla to Big Sur on the breathtaking Highway 1. From there, I explored Yosemite's majestic peaks, cruised through the stark beauty of Death Valley, and hit the buzzing streets of Las Vegas before heading to the warm embrace of Phoenix. Along the way, I stopped at dealerships and parking lots, striking up conversations with owners. Some of them looked at me with envy, amazed that a guy in his 30s could just pack up and roam like this. 3 months and 8,000 miles later, I decided it was time to return to Silver City. When I pulled into the lot at Hopeless Auto, the sight that greeted me warmed my heart. My entire team was there, including a few new faces. Their smiles and waves made it clear I was missed. As I stepped inside, I saw Olivia look up from her desk. Her smile grew even wider as she stood, walked around the desk, and wrapped me in a tight hug. We chatted for a while, catching up on everything that had happened in my absence. The business was thriving under her leadership, just as I'd hoped. After a bit I said, "What do you think about closing up early today? I'd like to invite everyone to Wrangler's for food and drinks. My treat." "That sounds perfect," Olivia said, beaming. "It's already 3, so we'll close at 5. I'll make sure everyone's there." "Thanks," I said, heading out to run a few errands before our get-together. Later that evening, I arrived at Wrangler's and was greeted by my team's laughter and lively conversation. It felt good to be surrounded by familiar faces again. We shared a hearty meal, traded stories, and caught up on all the little things I'd missed. After about an hour and a half, people started trickling out, thanking me for the evening before heading home. Eventually, it was just Olivia and me left at the table. She looked at me thoughtfully, her warm, knowing smile returning. "You know, Kurt," she said gently, "you might feel helpless sometimes, vulnerable, even like you're out of your depth. But you're wrong. You just have to trust the people you care about." I paused, her words sinking in. "So," I said quietly, "you figured it out." Her smile grew wider. "Yeah, it took me a little while. But when you said the new name tells the whole story, it all clicked." For a moment, I just sat there, taking in her unwavering confidence and support. She was right. The name Hopeless Auto was more than just a clever play on words. It was my story, my journey, and perhaps my redemption. That conversation with Olivia stayed with me, her words resonating long after we said goodbye. "You might be Polish," she'd said, "but all those jokes about you are nothing more than insults. They don't define you or your heritage." She was right, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. I looked at her and said, "Thank you, Olivia. You're the main reason I came back. I had to see how you were handling the responsibilities I left behind. I'm happy to say, you didn't just fill my shoes, you created your own path." Her face softened, and she smiled. I had an excellent mentor. We hugged, a moment of mutual respect and understanding passing between us, and then she left to go home to her husband. He truly was a lucky man. I returned to my apartment, a place I hadn't set foot in for 3 months. The air was humid and stale, so I opened the windows to let the cool night breeze flow through. Sitting on the terrace with a cold beer in hand, I overlooked the pool. A few people swam leisurely, and the laughter of a family nearby floated up to my balcony. I let my thoughts drift to Emily and me. We had started with so much hope, so many dreams. But somewhere along the way, everything had fallen apart. Love turned to resentment, and dreams dissolved into this bitter mess. Looking at the clock, I saw it was nearing 8:30. A thought struck me, a thought I'd been avoiding for months. It was time for a confrontation. I grabbed my keys, jumped into the Miata, and drove to the house, my house. I had purchased it before I even met Emily, and my name was the only one on the deed. But as I pulled into the driveway, my chest tightened. The yard was overgrown, the flower beds overtaken by weeds, and the landscaping was untouched. This wasn't the home I had left behind. The lights were on, so I knew Emily was home. I took a deep breath, walked to the door, and knocked. A moment later, the door opened, and there stood Sophia. Her eyes widened in shock. "Dad?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and hesitation. "Hi, Sophia," I said gently. "Is your mom home?" She stammered for a moment, then turned her head and yelled, "Mom!" From the kitchen, Emily's sharp voice cut through the air. "What is it, Sophia? What's going on?" Sophia didn't answer, still staring at me like she couldn't believe I was there. Instead, she shouted again, "Dad's here!" Emily appeared from around the corner, her face pale and her expression tense. When she saw me, her voice turned defensive. "What are you doing here?" I stayed calm, keeping my voice level. But before I could answer, David came strolling out of the bedroom in nothing but his underwear. My stomach twisted, but I kept my composure. "Oh," I said, my tone thick with sarcasm. "Looks like the whole family's here, Mom, Dad, and the kid." Emily's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. I nodded toward David. "Well, it seems he's moved in to take my place. It's only fair, after all." Before Emily could respond, Sophia chimed in with defiance in her voice. "Dad, David lost his apartment after you fired him. Mom needed someone to help with the bills and take care of things while you were gone." I looked at her, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Sophia, you're misinformed," I said, hating the way my voice sounded like I was lecturing her. "David was never my employee. He insisted on being a contractor, so I couldn't fire him. And as for the bills? All the utilities are paid. So is the car insurance. And what about food and gas?" Emily interjected, her voice rising. "You had a job, and you lost it. I know it was just fun money before, but it covered food and gas while you were gone. So what now? Do you think I'm just going to let you waltz back in?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Emily. I don't think that at all. I'm not here to move back in. I'm here to tell you that you and your lover need to find a new place to live." Her face turned red with anger. "I'm not leaving my home," she said defiantly. "Correction," I replied calmly. "This isn't your home. It's mine. I bought it before we got married, and my name is the only one on the deed." Her eyes narrowed. "Well, you left," she hissed. "So now it's mine." I gave a dry laugh. "The law doesn't work that way, Emily." I crossed my arms and leveled my gaze at Emily. "Since I'm still paying the utilities and taxes, I'm the legal owner of this house. And even though I've been away for a short time, it's still my property. Don't worry, though. I'll give you and your lover until the end of the month to find another place to live. Just make sure to take your daughter with you." Emily's face twisted in anger. "What do you mean, your daughter? She's our daughter." I let out a dry laugh, one that I hoped would cut through her indignation. "You couldn't have said truer words," I said, shaking my head. Her expression shifted to confusion as I turned to Sophia. "Sophia, I know how much you hate being called Polish. Well, I have good news for you. You don't have to be anymore. Your real father isn't me." I pointed a finger toward David. "It's him." The room fell into a stunned silence. It was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Finally, Emily broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "What?" I met her eyes, unflinching. "That's right, Emily. Your little indiscretion on our wedding day resulted in a child. But she's not mine. I shifted my focus back to Sophia. The good news for you, Sophia, is now you can take your real dad's last name. How does Sophia David sound? Sophia stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, and her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. And Emily? I continued, my voice cold. I can't help but wonder, did you insist on the name Sophia as some kind of tribute to your lover? A nod of respect for Geo David RG? I turned my attention back to her. She looked like she'd been slapped. Then her gaze shifted to David, whose face was pale as a sheet. What? David stammered. Oh, don't act surprised, I snapped. You don't want to be a dad? Well, too bad. Time to step up and take responsibility. It's only 4 more years until she's off to college. You've got this, right? Emily and David stuttered out almost in unison. I don't think so. I smirked and reached into my pocket, pulling out the DNA report I'd brought with me. Tossing it onto the table between them, I said, Take a look for yourselves. Emily and David picked up the paper, their eyes scanning the results. The color drained from their faces as reality hit them. Sophia, I said, turning to her one last time, tell your mom and her boyfriend that she'll be receiving divorce papers next week, along with an eviction notice. You've got until the end of the month to pack up and leave. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out the door. As I drove back to my apartment, my mind raced. All this time, I had wondered if their affair had been going on throughout our entire marriage. Had Emily ever been faithful to me? I thought back to how we first met. She'd come to the dealership to buy a car. David had been working on one, and we both thought it would be fun to make it a double date. But now I had to wonder, had she picked me, or was I just a convenient option? David, of all people. The same man who had cracked Polish jokes in front of me while sleeping with my wife behind my back. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than I'd thought it would. When I got back to my apartment, I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat on the couch. I didn't even turn on the TV, I just stared at the wall, trying to process it all. The next morning, I went straight to my lawyer's office and told him to start the divorce proceedings. I knew we'd have to sell the house and split the proceeds, but since Emily barely worked and David was now in the picture, I hoped to avoid paying alimony or child support. At least, that's what I told myself. I had loved Emily once, truly loved her. But now, all I could feel was anger and betrayal. David's laughter, Emily's lies, they echoed in my mind, eroding any trust one had left. Would I ever trust anyone again? Man or woman? Maybe I needed therapy to deal with this mess. As the divorce process moved forward, I decided to return to work at the dealership. But I made it clear to everyone, I wasn't the boss anymore. I didn't want the responsibility or the headaches. I was just there to sell cars. I gave myself one rule, sell 1 car a week. That was enough to cover rent and groceries, and I made sure to limit myself to just that. I even structured my finances so that if alimony was court-ordered, there wouldn't be much left for Emily to claim. At the end of the month, I had just enough for my personal expenses and nothing more. It wasn't much of a life, but it was mine. For now, that was enough. Emily's eyes welled up with tears as she stared at the table, her hands trembling. I leaned back in my seat, trying to process everything she was saying. The woman I had married, my wife, had been seeing both David and me at the same time. My stomach twisted with the thought, but I kept my voice steady. So, what was it, Emily? I asked again, this time softer, almost like I was trying to understand the betrayal, not just condemn it. She wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. It was never about love with David. Not really. I didn't know how to let him go. He was a comfort, someone familiar. But with you, Kurt, it was different. You made me feel safe, like I could build something real. I thought maybe I could have both. The words hit me like a physical blow. She had wanted both of us. Not just David, but me too. I couldn't imagine what she had been thinking when she made that choice, and now, hearing it laid out like this, I wondered if I had ever really known her at all. You thought you could have both of us? I echoed, shaking my head in disbelief. How long did you think that would last, Emily? She didn't answer immediately, just sat there, staring at the empty coffee cup in front of her. Then she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, she admitted. I was selfish. I loved you, but I couldn't let go of him. And when it came down to it, I chose you. I did, Kurt. But I never stopped loving him. That's why it all went wrong. I didn't give you my whole heart. And I never gave David up. Her confession hit harder than anything I'd felt in a long time. There had been so many good years between us, or so I thought. But now, sitting across from her, I was seeing a woman who couldn't even commit fully to one person, let alone the life we'd built together. Why didn't you tell me, Emily? I asked, my voice almost cracking with the weight of it all. Why lie to me for so long? We could have worked through it, if you'd just been honest. I was scared, she whispered. I didn't want to lose you, and I didn't want to face what I'd done. I thought maybe if I kept it hidden, everything would be okay. I sat back, letting out a breath. I didn't know what to feel anymore. Anger, sadness, betrayal, every emotion I had, I felt it in waves, crashing through me one after another. And yet, as much as I was hurt, I wasn't surprised. There had been so many signs, so many moments I had ignored or misunderstood. After a long silence, I finally said, So what now, Emily? What do you want from me? She shook her head slowly, wiping more tears from her cheeks. I don't know, Kurt. I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know the truth. I'm sorry for everything. I looked at her, the woman I thought I knew, and felt something break inside me. The truth. It's too late for that now, I said quietly, my words sinking like stones in the space between us. We're done. The house is getting sold, the divorce is moving forward. It's time to move on. She nodded silently, taking a deep breath. I understand. I'll leave soon. I won't fight you on it. I didn't have the energy to argue or try to fix anything anymore. The damage was done. I stood up, feeling the weight of the past few months settling heavily in my chest. Goodbye, Emily, I said, my voice low but final. I hope you find what you're looking for. But I can't be part of it. As I turned and walked out of the booth, I left behind a piece of my past that I knew I would never get back. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a small flicker of relief that I was finally moving forward, away from the chaos she had brought into my life. She hesitated again, her eyes darting between the table and me, as if searching for the right words. Finally she said, I didn't want to lose him, and he didn't want to lose me. Well, now you have each other, and your child, I replied flatly. By the way, he did a great job picking her name. I didn't even realize it until I had time to think during those 3 months on the road. She seemed stunned by my response, but I didn't care anymore. What more was there to say? The truth had come out, and it wasn't going to change anything. I didn't know Sophia wasn't yours, she said, her voice soft, almost uncertain. Really? I asked, more for the sake of confirming what I already knew. I wasn't surprised by anything she said anymore. She met my gaze and then added quietly, Kurt, I wanted to talk to you today to tell you that I still love you. It's nice to hear that, Emily, but I don't think you know what love is. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady but cutting. I loved you more than anything in the world, and you clearly can't say the same. I loved you, but I can honestly say I don't anymore. I loved you with all my heart, but now I only feel contempt for you. The words seemed to hang in the air between us, and she stared at me, the weight of it sinking in. It was clear that, in that moment, she realized that there was no going back. There would never be an us again. I took a deep breath, my gaze hardening. I have one last question for you. Did you ever stop seeing him? Did you ever stop sleeping with David while we were together? She hesitated, and then, as if the truth no longer mattered, she gave in. No, we never stopped. We had our ups and downs, but we usually got together about twice a month. Her voice trailed off, and I could see the shame in her eyes, but I didn't care anymore. It wasn't about her guilt or regret, it was about the damage that had already been done. I had hoped for a different answer. I said, my tone flat, but I'm glad you told me the truth. One more thing nagged at me, a question I'd carried for months. What happened a year ago that made you start treating me so badly? Your attitude toward me changed. The open contempt was obvious. She blushed, then grew slightly defensive. David started pushing me to try a threesome, not with you, probably because he knew you'd never agree to it. She looked down, guilt flashing across her face. I hated that he kept insisting, and I began to resent you for something I knew you'd never do. I know it sounds strange, but I thought I could have both my men loving me together. I resented you for not being the person who'd allow that. I was silent for a moment, processing the absurdity of it all. So, did you do it? I asked, the bitterness in my voice almost sharp. No, she said quickly, shaking her head. I thought about it, but then you left, and my whole world fell apart. Well, I said, leaning back in my chair, now you can do it knowing it doesn't bother me anymore. The words felt like they came from someone else, distant and detached. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it had all been replaced by a cold indifference. They could live however they wanted. It wasn't my problem anymore. 4 months later, we stood before a judge and were officially divorced. David was there too, sitting quietly in the corner. As we walked out of the courthouse, Emily looked at me, a faint glimmer of hope still in her eyes. Maybe we can grab a drink, like old times? She suggested, her voice tentative. I didn't even have to think about it. Sure, I said flatly, but in my head, I was already calculating how this would be the last time I'd have to deal with either of them. As we made our way to the door, I couldn't help but reflect on everything. The animosity I'd felt had mostly faded, but not entirely. I thought to myself, this will be the last time I ever have to be around them. Now they could live in their own mess. They deserved each other. Emily would have to adjust to a lower standard of living, but that was her choice, her consequence. Well, maybe the animosity hadn't disappeared entirely. I couldn't help it. I might be Polish, but I'm a respectable person. And they had taken that from me, in ways I couldn't even fully comprehend yet. But I would move on. That was the one thing they couldn't take from me, my ability to move forward.